we at least as a regulator, we have a challenge which we have to combine accompanying the internationalization of the financial system, so the global nature of finance, which is actually part of how finance has always been, with our own responsibility for financial stability at home. That's the tricky combination. That's an easy thing to do when things go well, and obviously it's a much more difficult thing when things go bad. And actually, that's why one of the responses when you have a crisis is actually to step up cooperation, because probably when things go well, actually things are not, cooperation is insufficient. Cross-border is, the international, global, is a source of opportunities and for growth, but it's also a source of risks, including of important risks. That's one of the experience of the crisis 10 years ago. It's also a source of possible circumvention of the rules. So I think that's frankly how we deal with the approach to cross-border aspect. You mentioned the historical development of the institutional setting. Actually, you should have mentioned also the IMF, which plays also a role in the international framework. And you have a sort of financial regulatory part with the G20, which is a political part, and with the FSB and the standard setting body. And then you have in trade, there is in the GATS, there's a financial services angle, which is rule-based, but with a very significant exemption, which is a prudential carve-out, precisely to recognize these difficulties of combining openness with the responsibility of financial stability. So for us, the multilateral framework is fundamental for financial stability and for the level playing field. And the level playing field is also important because if you have arbitrage, actually arbitrage is a source of risks, and it translates later on in risk to financial stability. We take a very active role in the G20, in the FSB. The G20, FSB, the reform is largely completed, with few remaining steps on Basel 3.75. I don't know how to, so the FSB now is actually looking at how reforms worked. And so doing a lot of impact analysis. I think that's good, and it's a challenge to do that in a multilateral context. They're also looking in that context on market fragmentation and trying to look and that's useful work. For instance, to what extent the home-based system set up in the 70s and 80s is today challenged by the fact that there are a lot of host-based elements that have been included, and actually we're experiencing that both in the EU and outside the EU. And also the FSB is looking at other sources of risk, leverage, non-bank finance, cyber, so doing a lot of good work. Multilateral alone is not sufficient. We combine it with very significant bilateral cooperation, part in the trade agreements and part with more regulatory cooperation, which is either formal or informal. And we do it both bilateral with jurisdictions, but also we try to do it more with regions. So we have an established dialogue with Asian colleagues in a EU-Asian forum. We're working to do something similar with Latin American. And these cooperation frameworks are extremely useful to compare notes, to understand, to pass messages, to receive messages, because we all have legislative regulatory framework which are slightly different, which have different constraints, different tools. So it's very important to understand each other. So we have a very good cooperation with the US, and Sharon is here. I hope she will say all the good about the work we do. We work with colleagues in Canada. That actually is part of CETA. I'm going to Canada next week for that. We have a dialogue with Japan, China, with India, and etc. And in the future, we'll certainly have a significant cooperation with the UK. That's the only Brexit comment that you'll hear from me today. And the third dimension of our international, and I'll try to make it simple, is the equivalence, which is the system we use in the EU to deal with cross-border aspects. the aspects are very diverse, so equivalence provisions are also diverse. They are actually in specific pieces of legislation, in sectoral pieces of legislation, does make the system particularly coherent or consistent, also because in the negotiation process, some things are added here and there, but that's part of the nature of how we do regulation. Equivalence has always a prudential concern. It's either to financial stability or to investor protection or to market integrity. And it falls, in our view, squarely under the prudential exception under WTO. It's not a perfect system, we'll never say that. It's what we have. I think it works, it gives a plus. Others have other mechanisms. No action, substitute compliance, supervisory equivalence, so not with the legal decisions that we take, but simply with decisions by supervisors, which might be less visible. And some are clearly extraterritorial in some of in what they do. It's a question of choice. It's also a question of how you manage the risk and how you enforce the rules. So I'm not passing any judgment, but I think it's worth pointing. One point which is essential is equivalence requires trust and cooperation. Without trust, frankly, you cannot have by equivalence. You're accepting to rely on somebody else. To rely on somebody else, you need trust. And I make an example. We have in the field of anti-money laundering and taxation a process of blacklisting, which is criticized, but let's leave aside for one moment. But obviously, if the use is blacklisting a country for problems in anti-money laundering, that is a problem that you have a difficulty on cooperation, and that will have some repercussion on equivalence as well. Exactly which repercussion will depend on the type of equivalence. So that's one aspect to take into account. The second aspect also, equivalence implies that we will monitor us or the ESAs, and the ESAs got a more significant mandate to this effect in the recent ESA review, to monitor development in the other countries, and in certain cases it also means that decisions will have either review clauses or time limitations because risks are very significant. So it's a complex system based on, and the three elements, multilateral, bilateral, and equivalence, are actually part of an imperfect system which deals with a very living body, which is the financial system in its international dimension. So I'll stop here. Thank you.